Hi, my name is Christophe Conceicao. I'm the managing director of Live for Good, a French NGO that supports young social entrepreneurs. And I'm excited to be the moderator of the session about active youth. In the next hour, we are going to talk about how to engage students and youth in general to be part of the solution. Why do we badly need young people to engage in social and ecological transition? What are the systematic barriers facing youth engagement, and how can we reach young people from all walks of life? And to answer these questions and to talk about these fascinating topics, we'll have amazing guests from CEOs to climate activists to young leaders. And my first guest is awesome. French educated, he graduated from the French Merchant Navy Academy. He is passionate about solving environmental issues. He actually carried out several studies and projects on eco-friendly ships, on circular economy, on low technologies in developing countries. In 2016, he co-founded Plastic Odyssey to tackle ocean pollution and to be able to really help the environment. Earlier this year, he was also nominated in the Forbes list 30 under 30. My next guest, I'm really honored to welcome Simon Bernard, co-founder of Plastic Odyssey.
Chaque minute, c'est plus de 18 tonnes de plastique qui se déversent dans l'océan. Comment est-ce qu'on en est arrivé là? Je m'appelle Simon, je suis ingénieur et officier de la marine marchande. J'ai navigué pendant presque 2 ans autour du monde. Et quand j'ai pris conscience des ravages de cette pollution plastique, j'ai eu envie d'agir.
On vient de passer une semaine en mer, on est allé récupérer le bateau au Danemark. On a amené le bateau pour pouvoir le mettre en chantier, le modifier et l'acheter. On l'a acheté aujourd'hui. Les
yeux qui pétillent. Bon, un peu de joie les gars, vous êtes propriétaires, mais enfin, allez, on sourit, on est content.
J'ai un peu le sentiment de passer du statut d'élève officier avec très peu de responsabilités et assez peu de connaissances au statut d'armateur qui est responsable du bateau et qui assume financièrement les frais.
L'objectif, c'est de faire de ce bateau un ambassadeur, un navire emblématique avec des solutions pour réduire le plastique.
Est-ce qu'on chanterait pas une petite Marseillaise?
When I was a child, I dreamt of becoming an inventor. What you see here is a drawing of a water recycling shower. It was written, don't pee or poop in the shower. And soon I've been told, well, inventor is not a job, it's not a real job, so you need to become an engineer. And to be honest, I couldn't see myself spending the day behind a computer working on a tiny mechanical part. And actually, I realized later on that what I meant by inventor was social entrepreneur. And so I joined the Merchant Navy Academy, probably to fulfill my quest of adventure. And 10 years ago, I became a sailor, joining the school. And curiously enough, I learned 2 crucial qualities required for all social or all entrepreneurs in general. The first one is, don't be afraid of learning by yourself. Because when you are on a 40 meters long container vessel in the middle of the ocean with only 20 people on board, you can't know everything. You don't have a degree for medicine or firefighting, so you have to learn by yourself. That's the first learning. And the second one is giving up is not an option. Because when you are in the middle of the sea, again, if there is an engine breakdown, well, you cannot call the after-sales service to say, I have a problem. you need to fix it by yourself and you cannot give up. So that's the two qualities very important when you are a sailor, but also when you are an entrepreneur. And so back at school, I started some side projects, and I could put all this theory into practice. But the first project was about soaps. Actually, with a friend of mine, we had the idea of collecting the soaps, hotel soaps, you know, the one you only use once to wash up your hands, and recycle it into new ones. Obviously, at the beginning, people couldn't understand. They thought we were crazy. Maybe they thought we were fetishists or, I don't know, belonging to some sort of religious movement. But after a while, we managed to convince one hotel, then another one, and another one. And at the end of the day, we had too many soaps, and we couldn't even recycle all of them. Because, yeah, obviously, we were doing that in the basement of the school, using a carrot grater and a microwave oven. But we managed to recycle almost 300 soaps, and to bring them, transport them to Morocco to raise children awareness. That was the first overview of what entrepreneurship means, really. Having a crazy idea, facing obstacles, reluctant people, but then keeping on going and eventually transforming this idea into reality and having this sense of achievement, incredible sense of fulfillment. So the next year, I carried on with another project. I took part with a team in an international competition to invent the boat of the future. The challenge was pretty simple. We had the same motor, electrical motor. We had the same ballast, 200 kilo to carry. And we had to build a boat that fit in a 3-meter square box. As I wasn't a naval architect, I went to see some experts and have some advices. And they say it's not possible. The specifications given by the organizer are not realistic, and you cannot make a boat with these specifications. But as I'm not an expert, I'm not a naval architect, I had this crazy idea of inventing a boat halfway between a submarine and a boat. So what you can see here is that all the cargo is transported beneath water, and so there is no wave at the surface, so less drag, less energy consumption. And obviously, the architect was a bit surprised when they saw that. But that was a very good example for me of what the explorer Bertrand Piccard always says. It's not the candle makers who invented the light bulb. And that was exactly the example. You don't necessarily need to be an expert to have a good idea. And you can actually think outside the box because you're not an expert in a field. So that was a good learning. And obviously, as you cannot succeed every time, the second learning was failure. The two next projects I had was complete failures. The first one was an idea of, well, why don't we use microalgae on board the shipping vessel to capture the CO2 of the engine, using the sewage of the crew to feed the algae and then make biofuel from all of that. Actually, it didn't work at all. We needed a huge surface to cover the vessel, so that was a failure. The second failure, you might have heard of it. It was called Scanit. It was a project I had. I had this idea one day when I was shopping. Why don't we could have a pesticide detector that you can just pick up every time you go shopping and just scan and see if there are pesticides in fruits and vegetables. And again, a failure because it was totally not possible to do it technically. But thanks to that, I had the chance to embark on another project. I discovered a low-tech lab, Nomade des Mers, were a team of engineers working on low technologies, a crazy approach to make affordable systems to answer the need of water, energy, electricity, and food, and so on, always with the same idea of making open source technology so that it can benefit to the greatest number and you can share the technology freely. So that was an amazing approach for me. I directly fell in love with this approach. And I had a chance to embark on this small catamaran that was sort of an ambassador, a laboratory of low technologies. And with this catamaran, we went to Dakar in Senegal. And that was the starting point of Plastic Odyssey, actually, because I saw all this plastic in the city on the one side, but on the other side, a huge ingenuity that was here, just in front of my eyes. You can actually, in Dakar, you can recycle cans, aluminum cans, you can recycle wood, steel, everything can be recycled but plastic. Plastic was the only materials remaining in the nature in the city. And I thought if we can adapt this approach of low technologies and open source systems, we can create technologies that will be able to turn plastic into something valuable in countries with low access to waste management. That was the starting point of Plastic Odyssey. And obviously we thought, okay, we need to share these solutions around the world, so we need a boat that will be a demonstrator, an ambassador of all these systems. And that's how it all started. So 5 years ago, with my two friends, Alexandre and Bob, we started with a small project. We thought, okay, we need to start small because we are just graduating from the school, so we don't have any contact, we don't have any network. We need to gain in credibility. So we started to build a small vessel, a very small catamaran, 6 meters long. That was our first demonstrator with a technology to recycle the plastic on board. And with this catamaran, we went around France to showcase solution and to show that if we can do that on a boat, basically we can do it everywhere. And so after this tour of France, we even ended up on the rooftop of the Galeries Lafayette in Paris, which was quite an amazing event, and enabled us to become credible, to find partners, and then to launch the bigger project, meaning 2 years ago, buying this former research vessel, quite a big one this time, 40 meters long, and to transform it, to refit it, to embark all the different technology we could imagine to turn plastic waste into a resource in emerging countries. And so this boat will set sail this year to go to Africa, South America, and then finally Asia. That's the beginning of a great adventure now. And the idea behind that is obviously to replicate what we do on board and to give all the knowledge and the technologies to the greatest number in Africa or in Asia to start social businesses. So when I'm asked sometimes why I'm doing all these projects and why I'm doing that really, I don't have the answer, but I always remember about the storyteller of the Crazy Toads. I don't know if you know about this story. It says that the toads, once a year, migrate from one place to another, and they often come across roads, and sometimes they are killed by cars. And for some curious reasons, some of the toads are just escaping, they're choosing different paths, and they find sometimes a toad tunnel. You can see here on the picture. And thanks to these crazy toads that found a new path, they can save the species. And that's quite incredible because I think we can all become these crazy toads if we choose not to follow the others, if we choose to behave, not to behave like sheep, and if we invent other ways to do it. And you remember, we won't solve all the problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So that's crucial to become these crazy toads. In the end, I think we can all become the change we want to see. There is no school, you saw it, yeah, there is no school to become an entrepreneur, to become a social entrepreneur. There is no degree for it. So all you need to know is to keep, I think, this spirit of youth, not being afraid of learning, of trying, of failing. And most of all, remember, giving up is not a choice, is not an option on the vessel Earth. Thank you.
Wow, amazing. Thanks, Simon. So when is the next expedition?
So the next one would be really this big boat that will set sail in November. And our first stopover will be in Egypt. Wow. To then continue to Africa then.
Wow, looking forward to follow you on the next expedition. Thank you, Simon, and I wish you the best.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
So my next guests are both CEOs, co-founders of two amazing organizations. They are leaders of global communities, of innovators, of change makers. They know all about social innovation and youth. I'm very pleased to welcome Pablo Santaeufemia, CEO of Bridge for Billions, and joining us from Spain, and Matthias Scheffelmeier, CEO of ChangemakerXchange, joining us from Germany. Hi guys, I'm really happy to have you with me today. And the first question I want to ask you, of course, is can you tell us a bit more about you, your background, and what does your respective organization? And maybe we can begin with Pablo.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm Pablo Santaeufemia. I'm the CEO and one of the co-founders of Bridge for Billions. And the way we define ourselves is we are a network of entrepreneurship and innovation programs. And our mission is to make entrepreneurship ecosystems more meritocratic, more inclusive, and more efficient. Unfortunately, a lot of the entrepreneurs around the world don't have access to training, to mentoring. And the way we solve or we tackle these challenges by building very scalable programs with partners, with all kinds of agents of the entrepreneurship ecosystem. And today we have supported around almost 2,000 entrepreneurs from 80 countries.
Wow. Thank you, Pablo. Matthias?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and having me. It's a privilege. My name is Matthias, and I am the co-founder of ChangeMakerXchange. We're a global community of nearly 1,000 young social entrepreneurs in Latin America, Europe, Asia, Africa, around the world, who are working on their individual social, societal, or environmental projects. And what we try to do is to really give them a community and access to a network of like-minded individuals where they can exchange ideas, share about the good sides of being an entrepreneur, but also share about the hardship of being an entrepreneur, open up to each other. And we want to be this safe space where change makers can learn from one another, share resources, collaborate with one another. And ultimately, I would say our vision as an organization is to create a social impact ecosystem that is more rooted in personal connection between people, more rooted in honest discussions and conversations about the hardship of creating social change, about well-being, about collaboration and the importance of systems change. And I'm very happy to be with you all today here. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. So many questions for you. But before, I don't know if you were already online, but we had this wonderful testimony of Simon, a young, very committed French entrepreneur. But I couldn't help myself to think that all young people are not as engaged or even as aware of the big challenges that we are facing in our societies, about our planet. So the first question I want to ask you is, what's your opinion? What do you observe in terms of levels of engagement among youth? Maybe Matthias, to begin?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think it is growing, while it still has to be stated that not all youth get the opportunity to really be involved in social change. And I think that is rooted in an education system that places more importance on helping people understand the world and fitting into the world as workers in an economy, for example, versus helping them to shape the world around them. So it starts really at a very young age, and with our education system and what it caters for, which is not really empowering people to become change makers, but rather fit into an existing system. But it also continues, you know, if we look at young people today winning Nobel Peace Prizes like Malala, really raising awareness on the most critical issues in the world, like Greta would do on climate change. And we still, as society, don't seem to fully take them seriously. If I was a 14, 15-year-old Fridays for Future participant in 2021, I would feel like the world and the society is letting me down. I am engaging, I am contributing, but even if I do that, I don't get the recognition and the awareness and the credit and the support that that I deserve as a young people shaping my world. And there's certainly so many others, and Pablo, I'm sure, will contribute a few more thoughts, but those are just a few insights that I'd like to share when it comes to that question of why is youth engaged and why aren't some.
Pablo, thoughts?
Totally. I agree with Matthias. I think that at the end of the day, change is a process. Because it's a process, you can be trained and you can practice it. However, I believe that the world is changing at a speed that is much faster. That means that we really need to include the younger ones earlier. And unfortunately, as Matthias was saying, the youth still are not really involved in the decision making, because before, let's say, in the decades of our grandparents, of our parents, change will happen within that generation. But because change and the effects of these changes are affecting more than 3 generations already at once, we really need to involve in the decision making the youth, and unfortunately, they're not involved. And what are the reasons that they're not involved? Well, I think it's because of the speed of change. That's one, and also from the systemic barrier. I think, as Matthias was mentioning, the educational systems, and it's not just in Europe. This is a global problem. They were designed for, and this is many of the situations. A lot of the systems today, they were designed for people that no longer live, for a world that no longer exists. And the need of changing these systems, through innovation, through entrepreneurship, it's a must. But then, once again, if change and if access to opportunity to generate that change is not meritocratic, if it's not inclusive, then we have a problem, because then you are having the haves and the have-nots. The ones that are very active and they have the opportunity to change, and then the ones that don't even have the opportunity to engage and basically become escapists, become evaders from the reality. And that's when you start having a very polarized society. So I think, as a society, we really need to be careful of engaging the youth, because the changes that are happening today are not affecting just one generation, but they're affecting many more, and many more future generations. So it's critical that we are all engaged. However, it's not easy. We have a lot of barriers still to overcome.
Thanks. So you talked about role models like Greta. We have actually 2 young climate activists that is joining the session in a few minutes. But what about youth from disadvantaged backgrounds? Do you see that kind of youth in your respective organization? And how can we reach and interest these youth?
I will say that being disadvantaged, at the end of the day, it is definitely a barrier. But you see great examples of people from disadvantaged backgrounds that are excelling in change making, that are really, breaking through. So I wouldn't say it's so much about being disadvantaged, which it is, definitely. Having access to opportunity is critical. But there are people that, even if they are very privileged, they don't have a clear ikigai, a clear purpose. So they don't really know what to do either. So when we think of change, when we think of engagement, what are we really thinking about? Are we really thinking about just money and wealth? Or is opportunity also the possibility of identifying your purpose, of identifying why you are doing what you're doing? I think wealth in the future will really be a lot more related to, that aspiration of transcendence, of being able to achieve that self-actualization, and not so much in wealth acquisition.
Thanks, Pablo.
Yeah. And Christophe, I'd love to add a thought here, which is your question really reminded me of a metaphor of Muhammad Yunus that he uses a lot when he says that every human being is actually born an entrepreneur, a maker and a shaper. But we humans sometimes in our own societies treat ourselves a bit like bonsai trees, and we limit ourselves through systemic barriers. And I would say youth from underprivileged backgrounds in some cases are even more resilient and more creative, and have sort of that street wiseness that comes with being in difficult situations. But we all have to, as Pablo and I pointed out earlier, really do a much better job in creating empowering learning ecosystems for people to actually flourish as change makers. And to also really put the resources behind that, walk the talk and put the money where the mouth is. Still today, over 60% of young social entrepreneurs in our networks at ChangeMakerXchange, at Ashoka and elsewhere can't really financially compensate themselves for their work, for example. There's huge issues with stress and well-being. A lot of young change makers are so much under pressure that they face the risk of burnout and unhealthy levels of stress. And all that just doesn't really add up, given that we are in a world right now that urgently needs everyone to participate and needs everyone's creativity. And therefore, we all need to do a better job to, create an empowering system that allows for human potential and change making to flourish.
Wow, powerful thought. So you talked about the educational system as one of the systematic barriers facing youth engagement. What are, in your opinion, the other main systematic barriers facing youth engagement?
I will say that one of the challenges is not just that is the educational system, it's literally every system. When we think of the generations of our great grandparents or grandparents, it was more about achieving peace, stability. Our parents might have wanted respect, recognition, but our generation, especially millennials and Gen Zs, they're really looking for transcendence, for self-actualization, and none of the systems are actually designed to achieve this. So when you are seeing that the fuel that young people are being nurtured by is not really the coin, the currency for these systems, then you start seeing challenges in literally every system. Thinking of not only the educational system, but the labor market. It was designed for, we were trained for a labor market that when we, at least me, when I finished university, it didn't exist any longer. So it's really difficult to say it's just one barrier. I think it's literally in every system we're finding barriers because of these generational shifts.
Yeah, I want to really echo that, Pablo. I think we're really leaving that age of repetition and things being predictable and people being trained and supported by the systems around us to perform in a world that is linear, step-by-step, repetitive, predictable, and entering an age of exponential rapid change where the skills and competencies and the empowerment that people will need to flourish in this world, while at the same time solving our collective crises, have to be very different. So I really want to echo Pablo's point about this being deeply ingrained in the mindsets of people. It's almost deeper than systems, if you think about it. It has to do with how we design all our systems, like Pablo said, and I think that's a question of mindset. What do we want as society? Where are we going? Are we ready to enter this age of disruption and change and exponential growth and rapid accelerating change? And I think we are in some cases, but there's a long way to go still.
So really interesting. Deeper than systems, it's in the mindset of people. So you are leading global communities all around the world. Do you see any differences from country to another? Is there any countries that set apart from the crowd in terms of youth engagement?
Well, it's very difficult to, because there are youth, for example, there are countries where youth is very engaged politically. However, then they're not so engaged in the entrepreneurship ecosystem because, again, that system is more reactive to youth. I will say that because of our educational system in Europe, I do think that people are very engaged and more people are being engaged than potentially what our parents or the generation before in entrepreneurship. And we're seeing that with the growth of entrepreneurship intentions in youth. And that's the world that I'm mostly part of, the world of innovators, the world of early stage entrepreneurs. But then when we think of other countries being more engaged, like, for example, not just a country, even continents, like Latin America or Africa, where they have the highest entrepreneurial activity and highest entrepreneurial intentions in the world, then you start thinking, how is it going to be the world where, for example, Europe has the lowest entrepreneurial intention versus Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia has the highest. No? So again, in every system, we could think of different advantages or barriers. that youth have, the one that I'm most familiar with, I think there is change in all of the ecosystems, but still a long way to go.
Yeah, I want to echo you, Pablo, and say it really depends on what you're looking at in terms of the differences between the countries. And I usually am very careful with naming individual countries, but I feel like I want to give a shout out to one, which is Nigeria, because in literally any activity that we host these days, the highest number of people that apply for them, that are engaged, that want to participate, usually come from Nigeria. It's quite an interesting trend that I observe, and this reminds me that I wanted to actually look a lot deeper into this, because a lot of the young change makers and social entrepreneurs that I come across these days seem to be connected to that community. And so, yeah, this is maybe just a little anecdote from my day-to-day work. But other than that, it really depends on what you're looking for in terms of the criteria on how you would evaluate your question.
Interesting. So we talked about obstacles, barriers. Let's talk a bit about solutions. So how can we, as citizens, practitioners, or even politics or universities, how can we overcome these obstacles? What solutions are out there?
So I think, as I was saying earlier, because one of the main systematic barriers is that people are getting into a labor market. They're basically becoming, they're being asked to become change makers without understanding what change they want to make, without understanding their why, their purpose, their the Japanese ikigai, what you're good at, what the world needs, what will you be paid for. And when you think about all of the challenges that youth have, one of the main things that youth need to have is understand their destinations. And maybe it's not the final destination, but their next destination. And already thinking that this is a skill to have, that our educational systems are not really preparing kids to think of what do you want to do and why do you want to do it. It's more about, can you follow the process? Can you put an X here? Can you add this and that? So I will say that purpose is something we really need to educate our youth, from the earliest ages, because it's something that is very, very important for the world that we're living in.
Matthias?
Yeah, and I feel like since Pablo commented already on the systemic dimension of your question, I feel like what I could add is maybe the individual dimension when it comes to individual young people that are having the courage and the motivation to make change. I think what I'm observing is that those that find communities of like-minded individuals, so go out, find people that do the same as you, that have that drive and that passion, and it really gets you a long way. I also think that finding mentors, experts, people who give you access, who open doors for you, you can connect with, you can rely on, is really a great resource. And one thing that entrepreneurs sometimes hesitate, in my opinion, for the wrong reasons, is to actually share your ideas. So talk about it all the time to anyone you can find. And that's how you can test it, how it takes shape, how you win supporters early on. So find a community of like-minded individuals, find people to support you, mentors, experts, supporters, partners, and talk about what you want to change in the world, because that conversation is literally the beginning of shaping this world that you wanna see. So don't shy away from actually voicing what you wanna achieve, and don't be afraid that somebody would steal your idea or anything like that. It really is quite the opposite.
Yeah, common idea among young entrepreneurs. So, Pablo, you talked about purpose, the why. So, how can we teach our teachers, our practitioners to help young people to find their why? What's the plan to do that?
So, I think that one of the things that people do need, and we all need to do this, and even if we're not aware, we have done it, which is we need to reflect on our values. Whenever I think of actually anything, any project that you embark yourself on, it's like an expedition. And you need to know the top of the mountain that you are hiking, but then you also need to know that what's the compass that you're going to use. You know, what are those values? And if you go into a process of identifying your values, you're basically going into a process of understanding yourself better. And this is why, you know, self-awareness is such a critical thing that we need to start teaching the younger ones. Because if you're not self-aware, if you're not fully, if you don't understand really who you are, you will never be able to understand why, you know, who do you want to become and why do you want to do what you do. So when we think of the destination, it's really important, because if we're only focusing on adding things in our backpack, you know, like trying to, and a lot of times, you know, people talk about all the different skills and soft skills that people need, which are many, but then it's like, what for, you know, if you don't know the destination. And this is unique to each person. And one of the things I will recommend everyone, especially the youth, because we always tend to do this. I myself, you know, did it for many, many years, is stop comparing myself with others. Because every journey is different. Every person is different. Values, your compass is different. Therefore, your why, it will be different. And your journey is different. So, yeah, I will leave it here.
I love that idea. Engagement as a journey, as an adventure, put resources in their backpack. So, Matthias, you already share one solution is to join like-minded communities. What other piece of advice, resources, or even programs a young leader can join to really do their part?
Yeah, so I think just like the recommendation to find other young people who are engaged, there really is a growing, what we would sometimes call ecosystem of support organizations for young changemakers. And I just want to name a few, among them ChangeMakerXchange, the one I represent, Bridge for Billions, the organization that Pablo represents. There is also Unleash, One Young World, the Obama Foundation, Kofi Annan Foundation, Masterpiece, and many others that I'm sure if you find one of them, they're all connected in one way or the other, you would find the others as well and kind of find the ones that fit your project and your needs and your challenges the most. My message here to the young people that might be listening into this is they're out there. Go and ask, be bold, don't shy away from asking for help. There is a growing number of organizations whose single purpose of existence is to support change makers in their journey towards impact and making the change that they want to see in the world. So go out there and find like-minded change makers your age that work on issues, but also look out for the support organizations. They do exist, and they're here to support you, and they have your back.
Thank you, Matthias. So one of the main course of action to really have an impact on the world is social entrepreneurship. And you both know a big lot of deal about social entrepreneurship. So what's your point of view? Is social entrepreneurship, young social entrepreneurs, going to change the world? Is that the way?
Well, I am of the opinion that entrepreneurship will be social or will not be in the future. So I think we're just in a world, you know, in 2021, where we're seeing two kinds of entrepreneurship. But I think they will basically merge into the same one, or that's at least really what at least I'm working for. So I do think that understanding the why of what you're doing, no? When many times from Bridge for Billions, we talk about purpose-driven entrepreneurship, because it's not just, oh, I want to do good. It's not enough to have good intentions, but it's why do I have those intentions? And then can I measure the impact that I'm having? A lot of people might be thinking that social entrepreneurship is basically supporting people from disadvantaged communities. But if you do that and you don't measure the impact, if you're not able to prove that what you're doing actually has a positive impact, then you're not really a social entrepreneur. The same way that, you know, traditional enterprises, they measure their financial health, and then you can tell this business is healthy or not. You know, social entrepreneurs, social enterprises, we need to measure not only financial health, but also the social impact health. I do think that there is still a lot of challenges. Again, the ecosystems are not prepared for the changes that need to happen in 2021. But, you know, little by little, we're making those changes. But there again, there is a long way to go.
Yeah, I would fully agree with what Pablo said. And, you know, if you look back into history, it actually can be seen that it was very often social entrepreneurs, maybe called differently at that time, that brought about the most dramatic systemic changes in society. If you think of the topic of early childhood education and Maria Montessori, who's the founder of the first ever kindergarten in 1906 in Rome, the Casa dei Bambini, had brought to the world the idea that young children, their capacity can be built and their creativity can flourish. Or Florence Nightingale, who invented the modern profession of nursing, and so many examples of today. So yes, I'm a big believer in the impact of social entrepreneurship if done with the right intention, if done well, if evaluated carefully, if impact focused, like Pablo said. I also think, though, that the even more dramatic change would come from a societal and global mindset shift, that we are entering an age where everyone is a change maker or potentially can be, and where everyone can and should be empowered to be entrepreneurial, and one where, you know, some great liberation could take place of you can shape the world around you just as much as other people who might in the past have had more power. And you can make that change as well. So I think that's something, it's a lot harder to measure because it's not individual projects or individual ventures that we're looking at here, but it's a bigger shift. And those two in combination, I mean, what better field to be in, what better work to do than to be involved in this great transformation of sorts.
Wow, it's fascinating, and we are approaching the end of the panel, but thanks a lot, Matthias and Pablo, for all your energy, all your ideas. I look forward to follow your respective organization, and I wish you the best for the future. See you soon.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
So my next two guests need almost no introduction. They are well-known spokeswomen on climate change. They are climate activists, they are entrepreneurs, they are founders. And they initiate multiple initiatives on social justice and climate change. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Clover Hogan, founder of Force of Nature, and joining us from London. Hi, Clover. Hi, Clover. Welcome. I'm very happy to have you here with me today. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm doing really well, thank you.
So I'm really excited to have you with me and with us in this session. And the first question I want to ask, because you're extremely young, extremely successful, a climate activist. So the first question I want to ask you is, how did it start? How did you get there? And when and how did you become a climate activist?
Thank you for the question. So I grew up in Australia's tropical North Queensland, fishing frogs from the toilet and dodging snakes that hung from the ceiling. So I was very lucky in that nature was never an other for me growing up. It was really my place of security and refuge and safety. It's where I went when I was trying to, run away from school or when things weren't going well at home. And yet when I was 11, I discovered how just under threat our natural world truly was. So I wasn't allowed to watch horror films growing up, but I turned to documentaries instead. I watched The Cove and An Inconvenient Truth, and I was suddenly seeing these images of million-year-old forests being bulldozed to produce Big Macs and dolphin hunts that turned the shoreline red. And seeing these images, I was filled with despair and heartache and a deep sadness. And at the same time, I was really, really confused. I couldn't understand at the age of 11 how this was the first time I was learning about the climate crisis, about the biodiversity crisis. You know, these were challenges that were going to define the rest of my life, that were going to define the future of my generation. And yet I'd never heard about them in school. I hadn't heard about them through Australian media or Australian politicians. And I certainly hadn't heard about them sitting at the dinner table with my family. So that was what catalyzed me to want to spend the rest of my life as an environmentalist, as a climate activist. And critically, that's what catalyzed in me wanting to understand why we shut down from these issues, why we try to put them on the back burner, and really understand the role of mindset in being able to mobilize action.
Wow, fascinating background and story. Thanks a lot, Clover. So more and more young people want to do their part, want to act for our beautiful planet, but they can feel a bit overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem. They may even think that, what can they do? There is little they can do. They may even think that there is no time anymore and that it's up to governments and big corporations to act. What do you think about that? And what would you respond to these young people?
Yeah, I think that's a really good analysis. I mean, there's quite a mainstream rhetoric that young people feel inspired and empowered to create change. And I think there are young people who do. And yet when I first started working with students, you know, volunteering in classrooms across the UK, I didn't hear empowered young people. I heard young people who were terrified of the future that we were inheriting. You know, I would speak to 8- and 9-year-olds who kind of depicted this dystopian future that would be our planet. You know, 13-year-old girls who had already decided that they didn't want to have kids because bringing them into a world defined by the climate crisis was too scary. So we can really see this rise of what we describe as eco-anxiety. So those feelings of anger and grief and powerlessness in response to the climate crisis. Research in 2020 commissioned by Friends of the Earth showed that in the UK, over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds were experiencing eco-anxiety. And at my own organization, Force of Nature, we conducted research in 52 countries that showed that over 70% of those young people didn't just feel eco-anxious, but felt hopeless in the face of climate change, felt that climate change negatively contributed to their mental health. And critically, only 26% of those young people felt that they knew how they could make a meaningful contribution to solving this crisis. So there's a huge kind of mental health toll that we're not really talking about. And it's really, really scary to think about the generation inheriting this challenge, my generation, are potentially shutting down before they even have a chance to really make that meaningful contribution.
Fascinating way to put it, eco-anxiety. And is the level of eco-anxiety the same everywhere in the world?
I think it definitely changes according to your lived experience, and eco-anxiety shows up in really different ways based on whether you're living through the direct impacts of climate change. For example, living in a place like the Maldives, experiencing rising sea levels, living in Jakarta with mass flooding, even in Australia with the wildfires we had in 2019, and versus those of us who are living in a bubble of relative climate privilege. You know, in a place like London, where I live, where the direct impacts of climate change still seem like a far off kind of distant threat. But I think critically, it's really important to embrace this eco-anxiety because it shows whether you're living through the direct impacts or climate change is still something that you read about in articles. More and more young people are really switched on. And every climate psychologist we've spoken to has said, the problem isn't that young people are eco-anxious, it's that their parents are not. So those in existing positions of power are still largely in a state of denial around the climate crisis, whereas eco-anxiety is kind of proof of our humanity. It's proof that we're not numbing ourselves as we hurtle toward the cliff. We're very much aware of just how prescient and prevalent this issue really is.
Interesting. So how do you do at Force of Nature to help young people who feel eco-anxious and to act on it, to do something about it?
Yeah, so we deliver programs to young people all around the world to support them to cultivate mindset of agency. So acknowledge the eco-anxiety, but then create space for the other feelings that are really critical to catalyzing impact. So the vision and community and feeling of contribution. So we do everything from a focus of how do we create those mindset shifts? And, you know, Force of Nature is made up of the young people we seek to serve. So we have young people facilitating these programs all around the world for their peers. And equally, you know, we don't want this change to happen within a silo. We really believe in the power of intergenerational exchange. We kind of have this two hands clapping model. So while we're mobilizing young people to realize their potential, we work with an ecosystem of decision makers across business and policy and education to ensure that those who have historically been left out of those decision-making spaces have a real seat at the table. And what's really, really powerful, Christophe, is when you empower young people to realize their potential and walk those corridors of power, in doing so, you begin to change the institutional mindset. Because as much as young people are feeling eco-anxious, we realize that there's a bit of a crisis in imagination with lots of these leaders as well. So we are supporting those leaders to actually think outside of their own boundaries and dismantle some of those mindset barriers that they hold to.
Wow, so some people may think that an organization led by Gen Z millennials, it's not possible. It's a joke. How do you respond? And you prove them wrong, right?
Yeah, I mean, I held a lot of that imposter syndrome when I first started Force of Nature. To be completely honest, you know, the first year as an organization, it was a one-woman show. I didn't know what it looked like to build a team. I didn't know how to scale beyond one person. And yet now Force of Nature is a team of 8 incredible people, wow. And we have a growing community in 52 countries. So I think anyone is capable of doing anything, so long as you have that clarity of a North Star of here's the problem that I really want to show up and solve. And community is so central to that. You know, the moment Force of Nature shifted from being a one-woman show to being this flourishing organization it is today was when I simply shifted our mindset of there are young people in need right now, like young people who are really suffering with their mental health. And this was in the context of the pandemic. So you have, you know, a mental health crisis driven by a pandemic, also driven by climate inaction. How do we help them? And the moment we kind of shifted into that mentality, that's when we really started to grow. So I think we can all feel beholden. We can all feel, you know, the system is too broken to create meaningful change, or I'm too small to make a difference. And I still experience all of those feelings every single day. But it's up to each and every one of us. It's up to the future of our planet that we overcome those self-limiting beliefs and really just focus on the world that we know is possible, that we want to create.
Oh, interesting. So you talked about the pandemic. How did it have an impact on the global engagement of youth?
The pandemic has been really, really difficult, understandably, for so many communities. And I think in the context of climate and young people in particular, I think in the months and the couple of years preceding the pandemic, a lot of young people found their voice for the first time and found that through the youth strikes for climate, for Fridays for the Future, you know, taking to the streets, banner blazing. And that was really important for that sense of agency. So channeling those feelings of eco-anxiety into here's how I can contribute to solving the problem. Now, in the context of the pandemic, suddenly we were all kind of trapped in our living rooms, and for some young people that was a much worse reality as well because of what was going, you know, on in their home lives as well. So suddenly, you know, things are kind of turbulent at home. They no longer have that outlet. They are no longer able to connect with other individuals who are passionate about these issues. So we saw how the pandemic really escalated those underlying mental health issues and contributed to that sense of eco-anxiety as well. And to say but, I think young people, you know, have incredible ingenuity. And over the past year, I've seen so much innovation in terms of how we communicate about the challenge. We've seen an explosion in kind of memes and movements on social media, more and more young people being active in the intersectional kind of challenges. So showing up for Black Lives Matter, showing up for the climate crisis, showing up for gender equity, and more young people kind of democratizing this conversation and decentralizing it. So I think it's been a little bit of both, but it's definitely had a real toll on this generation.
Okay. So another common idea that we can hear from time to time from young people is that, after all, it's all our parents and elders' fault. The current state of the planet, it's their fault. So what do you feel about that? And what role do you think that intergenerational exchange has to play in climate change?
This is a great question. I think the kind of blame game that can happen, or, pegging one generation against another, is usually pretty unhelpful. I look at my own parents, for example, and largely because of the disinformation campaigns from the fossil fuel lobby, a lot of our parents and a lot of adults today were really not aware of the impacts of the climate crisis, right? There was a very concerted effort to keep most of the population in the dark. And I think, the same is true of young people today who feel powerless, with our parents as well. We often look at this huge, overwhelming challenge and we don't feel that we can make a meaningful contribution. And I've seen that working with business leaders who, from the outside, you think, these are some of the most powerful people on the planet with such sway and influence. And then you sit in a room with them and the barriers kind of come down and they say, I have no idea, how to solve this challenge. I feel beholden to the status quo. I feel beholden to the very systems that are perpetuating this climate crisis. So I think it's more helpful to think about where we are similar versus where we are different. And I think so many of us feel powerless, whether that is anxious 11-year-olds or concerned moms and dads or cautious corporate leaders. And with that, each and every one of us has a responsibility to own what we are capable of changing. And of course, often that is a bigger sphere of influence for the decision makers and our parents who might be in existing positions of power. So I actually think the real wisdom and energy comes from when we bring together this kind of velocity and creativity of youth with that knowledge of experience, and think about how young people can be constructive disruptors in these spaces, and equally how those decision makers can recognize that perhaps their mindsets are limited, or perhaps they don't have the perspective to disrupt themselves. So ensuring that those young people have a seat at the table. And when we've done this at Force of Nature with, big multinational companies and FMCGs, companies that touch billions of lives every single day, we've seen huge transformative impact because they're rethinking the systems in which they operate.
Interesting. So we are all in this together. So you talked about business leaders. Can you describe to us the nature of this collaboration with big corporations at Force of Nature?
Yeah, so Force of Nature has worked with companies like P&G, with Unilever, with PepsiCo, big companies that ironically I made mockumentaries about, when I was in 10th grade, going to school in Indonesia, because of their negative impact. So it's been a really interesting experience going from that grassroots to currently being in those spaces with these big decision makers who often don't exactly know what the path forward really is. But in terms of bringing this intergenerational exchange, we've done that now through implementing youth advisory boards, delivering the same classrooms that we do to students to business leaders as well, delivering trainings to actually upskill these decision makers within these spaces of the lived experience of young people. So very recently we launched our eco-anxiety trainings where we would go into companies and actually share, this isn't just a climate crisis, it's a mental health crisis as well. And what's really interesting, Christophe, is whenever I am in those spaces and I ask those leaders, why are you here? Why are you having this climate conversation? None of them have ever said it's because of, an IPCC report from the UN or because of some article they read, but because their child came home to them at the end of the day and asked, Mom, Dad, what are you doing about climate change? And this is that intergenerational exchange brought to life. And I think this has the power to change business, to change the leaders within these companies in a way that external interventions potentially don't have that opportunity. So I think this coming together of ideas and exchange through programs, through workshops, through research within their companies. The other thing that we hear a lot of from these companies is that not only are their own kids feeling eco-anxious, but young people, young professionals coming up through the company are also eco-anxious. And I think a lot of young people don't want to work for companies that are clearly contributing to this crisis. They want to be in workplaces where, they're defined by purpose and intent and transparency and ethics. And so companies, not only from a climate perspective, but from the perspective of getting the best talent, recognize that they absolutely have to change the way that they do business and make sure that is also reflected to the young people they're trying to attract into their organizations.
Really interesting. So in what ways these big corporations can and should play a role in engaging youth to be part of the solution?
Companies have an enormous responsibility. I'll never forget this one statistic that 100 companies are responsible for 71% of emissions. And unfortunately, what we're seeing currently is a lot of companies making empty promises scheduled far enough into the future that they require no immediate change. And we see that show up in greenwashing. We see that show up in gaslighting of employees. I had a conversation with a company recently which has a huge impact on the planet. And they said, well, we're going to empower our employees by telling them they can turn off the lights at home and they can buy reusable coffee cups, right? So actually putting the onus of responsibility onto their employees or onto, day-to-day consumers, rather than actually owning their responsibility and saying, here's how we've been part of the problem, and critically, here's what we're doing to be part of the solution. So when it comes to mobilizing young people, when it comes to delivering transformative climate solutions, companies need to shift from this incrementalist mindset, this token mindset of we're going to do the bare minimum and we're going to try and, stop doing less harm, to actually how do we do more good, right? Rather than our product or service being the end goal, how is that product or service a vehicle for solving a bigger societal problem? And I think there are disruptor companies that are incredible evidence of this. Impossible Foods is one where I first worked straight out of high school. That is a company born out of how do we change one of the most destructive industries on the planet? How do we change animal agriculture? And how do we create a solution for the customer that doesn't shame them, that isn't premised on self-sacrifice, but enables them and invites them to do the best thing for themselves and the planet, that doesn't cause any kind of giving up of the things that you love, right? So it's absolutely possible, but I think companies are still really, really beholden to this model of growth and, the bottom line over how do we actually create a world that we want our kids to grow up in. So companies need to do a really, really big rethink. And again, I think inviting young people into those spaces, because we haven't grown up in those systems, we have fresh ideas and new perspectives, is really critical to facilitating those mindset shifts that I believe are absolutely critical to being able to solve the climate crisis.
So the alliance of big corporations with young people can be really impactful. Thanks, Clover. My next question is a very practical one. When I look at you, I can't help myself to feel respect, admiration for all you accomplished so far. But from a young man or young woman perspective, it can also be intimidating. They may think that, wow, I don't have the skills, I don't have the network, I don't have the charisma that Clover has. So what piece of advice would you give to these young women? What steps they can follow to engage?
So I'd start by saying I feel all of those same feelings of imposter syndrome as well. I think we all do. we're rooted in a culture and a society where we compare ourselves to one another. So I would start by saying that's normal, and I get that. I think if I reflect on where I've had impact, it's really bringing together two things. So it's the focus of a problem and the focus of the skills and the talents that I uniquely have to show up and solve that problem. So I think part of the reason we can feel so overwhelmed in the face of the climate crisis is because it's a symptom of many interconnected problems that we all care about, from food waste to fast fashion to prison reform. And yet our impact lies not in dissipating our energy across all of those issues, trying to solve them simultaneously, but in focusing on your piece of the puzzle. So saying, what is that problem that ignites that fire in my belly? And how can I show up and solve that issue? And when we've identified what that problem is, what that why is, it's really critical that we focus on those unique skills that we have to show up and solve it. When I first became an environmentalist, I thought perhaps that would mean I would need to ride a Zodiac into the path of a whaling ship, or I would need to become a climate scientist in the Arctic. And I quickly realized I was neither brave nor scientific enough for either of those things. So I instead asked myself, what gives me energy? What do I just love doing with my friends, with my peers? And I realized that that was communicating. And, communication, storytelling is also what naturally catalyzed me to want to become an environmentalist. It was watching those documentaries, hearing the stories of people who were taking action. So I focused on that skill set, and I developed it and cultivated it over a number of years. The first time I ever got up on a stage, I thought I was going to projectile vomit on the whole audience because I was so terrified and nauseous. So we also have to step toward things that really, really scare us. But I believe that it was the bringing together of that focus of a problem, and here are the things that I bring to the table that enabled me to really realize my impact and realize my power.
Thank you, Clover. So maybe a last question before ending the session. You're a role model for many young people. What's your own personal role model?
Oh, this is such a great question. Okay, this might sound a bit cheesy, but I'm going to have to say my mom. She has kind of modeled to me from day one what it means to be in service of a bigger mission, a bigger cause. She's the kindest person I know, and she's believed in me when I haven't believed in myself. And I've really needed that role modeling when, the eco-anxiety has become so much that I, cry in the shower and I feel deeply sad and distressed. When I experience the burnout, which feels like a natural part of running an organization. And in fact, I mentioned the first time I got up on a stage and was absolutely terrified, knees shaking. She was actually there. And I wanted to run away. I wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. I think we've all experienced that, public speaking, one way or another. But she said, the reason that you're experiencing those nerves is because you're allowing your ego to get in the way. And in fact, you're worrying too much about what people are going to care about you, rather than thinking about the message that you were there to convey. And in fact, this has nothing to do with you. You are merely there as a conduit for a message. And that's the best piece of advice I have ever received. And I think that's true of all of us. We can allow this imposter syndrome or those self-limiting beliefs to get in the way. But the moment we, take a step back and think, what is it that we're working for? Who are the voices that don't have a platform, who we need to show up for? What is at stake here? When we take that macro perspective, all the other noise kind of falls away. So my mom is 100% my role model because she reminds me every day of what is important.
Wow, thank you, Clover. Say hello to your mom. I wish you all the best and keep up the good fight for all of us. Thank you, Clover. Bye.
Bye.
So it's the end of the session. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. A big thanks to all our amazing guests. A big thanks to all the ChangeNOW Summit team. And I wish you an excellent day. See you soon.